Hi, you guys. It's Dr. Betty Robin, and today we're going to go over our case study number 2. And I picked another practice in the Inland Empire because I really like a lot of the practices in the Inland Empire. And that's because usually the rent is considerably lower than in Orange County and Los Angeles County. And employee salaries are quite a bit lower as well. And you also have more patients per dentist in most cases and less dentists altogether. So the Inland Empire can be a really good place to practice. And some of you kind of overlook it, or you don't want to live out in the boonies or whatever it is. Um, but anyhow, I picked uh, another practice in the Inland Empire for this case study number 2. So let's get going. Okay, so what was my first impression of the practice? Well, I guess my very first impression was it took a long time to get there. For me, an LA and Orange County girl, it was quite a little drive. This was not in the central part of Inland Empire, and easy drive, but pretty long drive. But once I got there, the practice was easy to find, which I'm always a fan of because I think that I'm approaching the practice or coming to the practice like a patient would. Is it annoying and confusing to find? Um, in this case, no. Very easy to find and very easy to park. I didn't have to, walk very far. I didn't have to deal with the parking structure like you have to do, especially in a lot of places in LA. Um, it was easy. All parts were easy. I walked inside, and my first impression was that the practice was very clean and neat, but nothing fancy. Not that it has to be. And I feel like the practice was appropriate, appropriately decorated for where it was located. So, I'm usually a fan of having a decorator do the front office or the reception room. But, far out in the Inland Empire, I don't think that's really necessary as long as the practice is clean and neat. And this one was. I mean, it was relatively modern, equipment, I don't think more than 7, 8 years old. I mean, it was in good shape. It looked nice. It just was nothing fancy. But again, for where it was located, I think that was a good thing. Okay, and the next thing I like to look at is the seller interview or the seller conversation. And in this case, the seller conversation went very well. The seller is a straight shooter. And for me, those kind of people are really easy to work with. I don't like to work with sellers where every day there's another new surprise. Like, oh, I didn't tell you my assistant's quitting, or oh, I didn't tell you the landlord's doubling the rent when I leave. Um, I it's for me to do a good job for sellers and to represent the practice accurately to buyers. I just need to know everything up front, good, bad, or ugly. Let me know, and then I'll figure out if I can sell it for you or what we should do. No issues with any of that with this seller. He was a very straight shooter, um, very clear, very concise, and basically said he's willing to do whatever he needs to do to get it sold. He was ready to retire. So, excellent. He also handed me all of his tax returns while I was sitting there and some other documents. And I never take a seller's tax returns with me unless they've signed the listing agreement, which this guy was prepared to do. Like I said, there was no nonsense here. Um, but I don't like to, take people's financials until they're ready to give them to me. But I do require that they have them there on the appointment so I can get a good idea of the profitability. And so I can talk to sellers about what I think the practice is worth. And so we can sell it. Okay, so my first glance at the tax returns, which is what I want you guys to be able to do, is kind of follow the format that I'm going through with you. So you get a quick snapshot if this practice is something you want to go forward looking at, or you're going to walk away. Without you spending thousands of dollars on an accountant or a consultant yet at this point. Okay, so the first thing I see on this tax return is gross collections of about 1.5 million. So healthy practice. I mean, really, I'd like a lot of you to be looking at practices over 1 million. So you can make decent money and you can pay off your debt, and it can often work better. So this was, like I said, about 1.5 million. I glanced down to the ordinary income on this S corp, and it was about $650,000. I mean, that's a lot of money on just gross or for the net income without any add backs. I mean, this is clean number on the tax return, the amount the seller was paying taxes on. And in 25 years of doing practice sales, I've rarely seen a net income that high on a general dental practice. So this one had my attention, and I already thought it was an excellent practice. Okay, so first, or remember, I look at three things. First, profitability. Second, percent of staff wages to the gross collections, or the line one on the tax return. And thirdly, the rent. As a percent, everything is as a percent of the gross collections, which should be line one on the tax return. So with the profitability, I use that formula we've talked about before, CIDOAAT. C is for compensation. In this case, the seller did not take a salary along with the wages. Everything he took was bottom line. So I didn't have anything there. Interest, seller had paid off everything. There was no interest. Same, there was no depreciation. Everything, all the equipment had been depreciated. No amortization. Goodwill covenant, long since gone. No auto written off. I think none. I mean, it's less than $100. It was essentially none. And no travel written off. This was probably the cleanest tax return I've ever seen. This guy was literally paying taxes on every dollar he made legitimately, and like we all should be doing, but it was just a very, very clean tax return. So here I'm looking at about $650,000 of profit on 1.5 million. I mean, excellent. You should be close to 50% profit when you are at that gross collection level, and he was. So, number 2, percent of staff wages. Percent of staff wages in this case was 22 point something percent of gross collections. Again, excellent. And a function of being in the Inland Empire. The staff, I like staff wages to be between 25 and 27%, or I should say not more than 27%. If they creep up another percent or two, okay. 30 is kind of my cutoff. If the percent of staff wages exceeds 30% of your gross collections, I think it's just too high. And I think it's a very difficult problem to fix. And in many cases, a walk away for a buyer. Very difficult because obviously you can't cut staff wages and expect the staff to stay with good morale. And you really can't get rid of someone unless you have someone voluntarily retiring that you don't need to replace. So staff wages, if they're too high, there's just really nothing a buyer can do about it besides walk away from the practice. But this one was clicking on all cylinders in the 22% range. Again, excellent. Then I look at the rent. And in this case, the seller owned the building and was paying himself really low rent, like less than 2% of the gross collections. Let's talk a little bit about owning a building. I think owning a building is always a good idea for a buyer if if and only if I'll even say. I like it to be more than one unit, like a duplex or bigger, because otherwise you can, it might be too expensive um, to own if it isn't. So I like it to be for a seller, particularly, to have two or more units. That way, if a buyer moves out, they're not left with an unoccupied building that may be hard to rent. I like the price of the building not to exceed the price of the purchase price by very much. I mean, you can't buy a practice doing 1 million and a building priced at 10 million. That's never going to work. So the price has to be appropriate. And what's appropriate? Appropriate is that the amount of the purchase price amortized over 25 years or whatever the lender is loaning. 25 years is probably the most common, is is similar to the rent payment, which means it's no more than 7% of the gross collections is going to building costs. 5 to 7% is where you want to be. So again, to summarize, I'd like the building to be a duplex at least, and I'd like the price of the building not to exceed by too much anyhow, the price of the practice, because otherwise it is not going to make sense for you to buy it. But again, out in the Inland Empire, those kind of practices and buildings exist, as it did in this case. So that was icing on the cake for me to think, okay, now there's a building also, which means the buyer isn't going to have to pay rent and have ever escalating rent, which in Southern California generally escalates between 3 and 4% per year. So they can cap their expenses and really make some significant money. So everything is looking really, really good. Okay, now was the problem. Here was the problem. This practice was marketed heavily, and it was I marketed bragging about its profitability. Had 3 people show up. Okay, you buyers, when there's a diamond in the rough, you've got to be able to recognize it. And that's part of the reason that I'm doing these case studies. I mean, this practice couldn't be more perfect because it was extremely, extremely profitable, low salaries to gross collections, low building rent to gross collections, and the potential to buy the building. I mean, do you not want to make 600,000-700,000 a year? I mean, you gotta recognize it when it's out there. One of the people that looked at it wasn't interested, it's too far, etc. But the other 2 understood what it was, and both made offers. And obviously, only one could buy it, and the other one wasn't very happy. So, but sometimes I get huge amounts or huge numbers of people looking at practices in Orange and LA County. I've had over 50 people at an open house, and here I'm out, and it doesn't make that much money. And here I'm out in the Inland Empire, and no one wants to buy it. I really think you should look at a practice as a business as it is. And, businesses are to make money. You can have that beach house on the weekend or whatever you want to do, but you really want to make money. You want to pay off your debt, pay off your student loans. It's the way to do it. This practice was fabulous. Okay, my overall impression was this practice was, as I've already said, nearly perfect. And that is part of the reason that I'm a huge advocate for the Inland Empire, because it does allow practices to be financially very viable, as this practice was. And I'm not exaggerating at all by telling you that the buyer was able to double this practice's collections in a little over a year, because they started working full time, doing some advertising, and just working on fully maximizing the practice, which the seller had not done nor needed to do. He was already a pretty wealthy man, wasn't that old, and, going to live the good life. So this practice, I'm going to give a score of 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. And I can't think of any practice that we're going to be talking about or that I've seen. Very, very, very few practices get a 10. And I'm basing that number primarily on financials, profitability, staff wages appropriate, and rent appropriate. This one's a 10, you guys. Got to recognize them when you see them. Thank you for tuning in this week, and we'll talk next week.